strategy is a plan to deploy valuable resources for a sustainable advantage toward a business objective in a competitive environment. Those are the five pieces. Because if you're not talking about a competitive environment, you're not talking about a strategy. If I'm like, oh, my personal family strategy, I'm like, I wouldn't call that a strategy. You can use the term generally, but that's not a strategy. Strategy is when you are creating an advantage over competitors.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur Podcast, filled with marketing and leadership tips on launching and growing your business with your host, Deanne Mora.
My guest today is Jeff Holman, founder of Intellectual Strategies. His company is revolutionizing how startups and scaling businesses access legal support. As the creator of the first Fractional Legal Team, he provides companies with expert legal advice at critical growth stages without the need for a full-time in-house team. This innovative model helps businesses navigate early challenges and scaling decisions while reducing overhead costs. With degrees in electrical engineering, law, and an MBA, Jeff blends technical expertise with a strong legal foundation to tackle complex business issues. Admitted to practice in California, Utah, and before the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, Jeff is an inventor, strategist, and attorney committed to providing tailored legal solutions that empower businesses to succeed. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure being here, Dan.
Great to have you. Well, you have a rather non-traditional background for an attorney. So let's start with your backstory. What led you to what you're doing today?
You mean not every attorney has a background where they did high-end lighting design for 25,000 square foot homes? That's
It's not typically something that I encounter, but I'd love to hear the story.
maybe that's for another day. But there's no, I'm an experimenter. I love to learn. I love to find things out. Some of my past bosses, if you will, learned that I like to experiment. I'm like, you've been doing it this way forever. Why don't we try it this way? It might actually work better. And that for attorneys, that causes a little bit of consternation sometimes. But I'm a learner, and so I like to do things. I like to know where I'm going. I like to learn academically. I like to learn experientially, and so that's really guided what I do.
Well, that's great. Well, I'm familiar with the fractional model, which really started with CFOs, and I'm a fractional CMO. But talk to me about how the fractional legal model works.
There are a lot of attorneys who do a fractional model already. They often call themselves outside general counsel. So general counsel being, kind of the go-to attorney when you have a breadth of problems or issues in your business. You go to them, and they might have the expertise. They might know where to go to find the expertise. But that's been a model that's been around for a while, just with a different term. What we're doing at Intellectual Strategies builds on that model. So we have a fractional legal team. As I kind of fell into, and we can talk about the path together, but I kind of fell into this fractional or outside general counsel role at one point in my career. I realized that there was a lot of issues with it. A lot of things work well, and some things don't work really well. It's easy to burn out as a one-man band trying to manage every legal issue that comes up for different companies that are all growing and expanding and want you to grow and expand with them. So, you know, identifying that, I said, why would I do this myself? Why wouldn't I bring on essentially what is a fully staffed legal team with the breadth of expertise that startups and scaling companies need? That's who we focus on. But when they bring on that staff, so that when questions come up, a client can come to us with any question, and they can get the right expertise from the right attorney at the right time, instead of just always coming to one source who might be the right answer or might just be a bottleneck.
That makes sense. And so it's a little bit like, if you're working in a big corporation and typically they have a large in-house legal team and variety of specialties. And so there's always someone there that you can go to and call upon who will help with whatever the scenario is. But a startup typically doesn't have that. So is that what I'm hearing, that this is trying to address that gap?
Yes, very much so. A lot of startups don't have even an attorney because, I mean, let's face it, who wants to hire an attorney? Nobody, unless you have to, right? Let alone going and hiring multiple
Dude.
attorneys. So okay, that struck a chord, didn't it? You maybe been there. I
No,
get it,
no, not
right?
going to say that, but I know people who have.
Yes. So we clean up chaos, and so that's we get it. We get involved when there are problems happening a lot of times. Um, but the way I picture it is, that corner of the office where you go when you're like you have the issue, and if you could really pop your head into one office or two offices or even five or six offices and just say, hey, I was thinking about branding, or I was thinking about an invention, or I was thinking about this contract, vendors, investors, whatever it is. Heaven forbid, a cease and desist letter we got, and just go pop your head in the office of that person that can answer that question for you really conveniently. That's how I view it. We want to be the little corner of offices where you just poke your head and say, "Hey, we had this issue come up, or we're planning this thing. You know, do you have 30 seconds? I just want to ask you a question."
Yeah, yeah, and I don't want to have to, make an appointment and, whatever to pay you whatever your hourly rate is in total when, I only need something for 5 minutes. So,
Exactly.
um,
Yeah. And so we've
well,
tried to
so
we've tried to really structure it so that it becomes more of a collaboration rather than this tension, like you mentioned. I'm going to get billed if I make a phone call, and is this worth the phone call and like we don't want that. I do not know why attorneys have structured their business to make it more difficult for clients to bring problems to them when that's what we do. We're there to help solve problems, avoid problems, and yet we make it difficult if for no other reason by virtue of our billing practices, people don't want to call us. Like
yeah.
we've spent years becoming experts only to say, well, I'm going to implement this in a way that I don't want people to call me.
Well, yeah,
It
and
makes
then
no
you talk
sense.
you talk to your attorney and you never know, like those first few minutes when you're just talking about the weather and your family is like, is he billing me for this? Or it is
The
a
answer is yes,
really
probably.
uncomfortable relationship.
In most situations, the answer is yes.
So word to the wise, be careful, don't talk about the weather too much. So you mentioned that a lot of startups don't actually have an attorney, so they're not getting legal advice. What are some of the most common legal pitfalls that you see startups specifically falling into, and how might that differ as a company expands? So, if I'm a startup, what should be keeping me up at night?
There's probably two ways to answer this. Let me start with one way, and that is I think of startups as, it's just a bunch of people trying to do things, and you have these little initiatives all around the company, whether it's sales or product development or hiring and firing or leadership. There's these different kind of components to every business, whether you're small or large. You have them. You just might not realize how underdeveloped some of those are, right? And so I think of it in terms of playbooks, right? If you have a team that's developing a product, you have certain legal playbooks that you should be aware of. If you're hiring employees, there's legal playbooks. If you're engaging vendors, so as a way to think about it from a startup founder's perspective, you really should be getting be getting familiar with where are the triggers in your business that are going to potentially raise legal issues. I just got off the phone with one of my clients who has an attorney, me, and yet even at the startup phase, a lot of these inventors just they don't really they think they've got it handled. Like, oh, I'm just going to do this and it'll be fine. Well, you just implemented a new program. You just implemented a new, you know, aspect to your business, and you didn't run it by me, and so, of course, you're calling me now because you recognize there's a problem, and that problem might be a $500,000 problem for you. Like nobody wants that, right? Um, and so having access to the right people and using them when you identify these triggers is really critical. So that's kind of a really general answer, but let me put it into a little bit more context with the second kind of perspective that I would say. And so a lot of times we deal with people who have one of two mentalities, and uh, sometimes this matches with where they're at in their business. And I'm going to call it the first time founder mentality and a second time founder mentality, right? And sometimes our second time founders have a first time founder mentality and they repeat the same mistakes. But a lot of times what we see is first time founders, they don't know what they don't know, right? And in which with what I was saying before, they don't know where the triggers are. They don't know where the issues are that might come up that will trigger legal problems. right? Whereas second-time founders, they've been down that road. They've built a network around them to help them. And so they either know where the triggers are or their network will step in and say, hey, this is something you should really get advice on. You should bring somebody in, or I've seen this before and we did it this way, and so really being able to know where those playbooks or those triggers are in your business and being able to act on that, that puts, what I would call people into a second time founder mentality. And that's the real difference there is just knowing what you don't know. And, nobody expects a founder to know what they don't know in law because they didn't spend time in law. And even a lot of lawyers who spent time with 3 years of law school, they don't know where the problems are in an e-commerce business that's growing or in a SaaS business or, some of these specific types of business. That's a really general way to say it. Maybe we want to spend a minute. You can tell me. Maybe we want to spend a minute and say, well, there's maybe like 5 top areas where startup companies get into real problems.
I think we should talk about that because I know, before the show, we were talking that I think at last count, there's about 31 million entrepreneurs in the US, and there's that scary statistic that 65% will fail. And startups where, like tech startups and that, they have more of a 90% failure rate, which is really pretty daunting. And so serial entrepreneurs, so what you're talking about, the experienced entrepreneur, they're only 10% of the total of startups, but they make up a disproportionate share of new companies and 80% of all unicorns. So there's definitely something about that experience being an important factor. So let's dive into that a little bit more. And I'd love to hear your perspective on why that is.
Yeah. Um, so I think that yeah, the statistics really are scary in a way. I mean, it's kind of the natural progression, right? People are going into business and you have to experience. It's like having a baby, I think. At least it was for me, right? You have a baby, and before you had a baby, you're like, man, that looks pretty easy. After you have a baby, like, I never knew exactly what this meant. Now that I've had a baby, and then when you try to tell your friends, you're a young family, and you're like, oh, by the way, congratulations on being pregnant. This is going to change your life. They're like, oh yeah, I'm sure it will. And then they come back, they have their baby, and they're like, I did not realize what a change it was.
How does this little human take up so many hours of your day?
Exactly. And your business is another like little human, although it's a little human made up of a bunch of humans and a bunch of human relationships that can all go wrong at any point in time. So it's you just don't know until you've been there. And so if I were let's see. I think we got a couple questions out there maybe, but let me start with this one. If I were to go to a founder and say, okay, if you haven't been down this path before, you're starting your business, there's going to be a couple like first milestones where you really should be looking at getting legal help because you're likely going to make some mistakes to learn where those triggers are if you don't have the help up front. And that is, first of all, engaging with another founder. If you have another founder in your business, you need to plan for your divorce. A lot of people they analogize founders' relationships to marriage, and it is, but it's probably worse because money is like the main factor in that relationship a lot of times, and it's a difficult relationship, and you're going into it knowing there's a 60 or 90% chance of failure. I think that's maybe a much higher statistic than the failure rate of actual marriages. So it's going to fail, or you can at least expect there's a really high likelihood it's going to fail. Plan for that. If you're both setting the right expectations up front, you can plan for that. You don't have to say like, well, I'm gonna be a jerk when this happens. Like that's not the point. It's just when certain things happen, how do you get out of the business? When someone stops helping with the business, what happens to their ownership? Things like that. So you got to think about how do I get into this relationship, but more importantly, what happens if it doesn't actually work out? That's number one. Number two, if you start, a lot of times the next thing is I develop a product, and your product is, I'm going to use that term really generally. Your product is either a thing or it's a service, right? And if it's a thing, then you might be inventing a product, or you might be buying a product, or you might be. I have a lot of e-commerce clients who call me and they're like, well, I saw this product out there and it's been doing really well. I went and I bought it from China. I brought it to the US and I started selling it. And then I got a cease and desist letter, right? Because me
They knocked
selling
it
it
off.
happens to, they say, infringe somebody's patent. So there's all sorts of things about a product, about product sales, a physical product, either protect it yourself with your own patents or, know whether or not there's a risk of infringing somebody else's patent. Now, if your product is a service, which as attorneys we like to rename things, you wouldn't normally call a service a product, but we do sometimes. If your product that you sell, what you sell is a service, then you're all about brand, right? You want to be building a brand. I know a lot of kind of the mom and pop shop service businesses, a lot of plumbers, a lot of whatever it might be, they go into this and they don't really think about building a brand. But it's a missed opportunity. If you are building a business, you might as well build a brand because businesses that have like a registered trademark, which is what you'd use to protect your brand, businesses that have a registered trademark statistically are sold for a lot more money than the ones that don't, even though the service might be the same in both businesses. So there's actual value you're leaving on the table by just not attaching a brand to it. How do you do that? There's some simple rules. It's not very complicated, but you have to be in the right mindset to do it.
That's
So
a really good point. And you're speaking, obviously near and dear to my heart as a marketer when you're talking about building a brand. And so many people, they don't take the steps to protect that. But when you're saying that you might actually get a higher exit value due to the fact that you've taken the steps, I think we all watch Shark Tank and we see that, they get all excited when somebody has a trademark or a patent on something.
mhm.
And that's a patent in particular. And, that tends to increase the valuation. So, it sounds like taking those steps actually becomes an investment for your business.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And I love IP. My background is in intellectual property, and there's a whole kind of discussion around the speculative nature of launching a business and the speculative nature of intellectual property and the investment opportunity or cost that is. So, but that's probably a whole different topic around IP strategy.
Without going
Um,
too deeply into that, though, I think that is an important point where, if you're, let's go with a SaaS company.
mhm.
So you have an idea for this amazing app that's going to change the world. You haven't gone to MVP yet. You've kind of, it's probably you in your basement or your garage working with your friends, or now these days virtually working with your
Yeah.
friends. You're all coding and so like at what point in time do you need to start thinking of IP? Do you need to like hit MVP first to know that, okay, this has traction, I think we should do something, or you get the idea and you should jump right in?
It depends on the type of IP we're talking about because it's treated differently. And I just gave you the categorical attorney answer. It depends. In inventions, you want to, with your inventing a new thing that might be protected by a patent, you want to get some consulting up front because if you disclose that invention, then you might have given away your opportunity to protect that invention, right? On the brand side, oftentimes you want to do some initial searching up front to make sure that you've got a clear path to use the brand you've selected, before you invest all the money in either product or branding or launch or whatever it is. So make sure there's a clear path. But in contrast to patents, where using it or disclosing it up front is bad, using or disclosing your brand, your logo, your name, whatever it is you're using as branding assets for your business, that's actually a good thing because you have to do that before you can get a registered trademark. Now, you can kind of do it in parallel, but but using it is a good thing for your brand. So it does really depend on the type. So what I would suggest, and this goes for every area of law. When a startup is just first getting started, like it's worth having an initial conversation. And we do this with our clients or potential clients who are coming in. We'll sit down for 30 minutes. We'll say, hey, tell us about your business. Tell us about where you're headed. Tell us what you think your major milestones are over the next 12 to 18 months. You're hiring people, getting investors, launching a product, whatever it is. And we can just give you a little bit of guidance. Okay, if you're launching a product, think about A, B, and C. If you're interested in protecting your brand, here are some things. If you're hiring employees, and these are kind of the next things on the list that we would talk about. If you're hiring employees, make sure you have your onboarding and do these things. If you're getting investors, here's the things you should think about. And because these really are all part of a larger system. I kind of revert back into that engineering mode sometimes, and I'm like, a business is this big system of interconnected, interwoven things, and the type of entity, whether you're an LLC or a C corp, can impact how you raise money from investors or who you raise money from, and so everything is kind of interconnected, and we try to treat it. We try to simplify the conversations a lot of times and say, well, hire that person, fire that person, but that can have a ripple effect throughout your business in some other ways. So, you hire the people or you fire the people who invented your product. Well, if you didn't get the right invention assignments and transfer documents in place, you just fired the person who actually owns your IP, perhaps, right? There's just all these ripple effects. And so have a conversation. Talk about your first 5 or 6 milestones and just let an attorney tell you what those signposts are, what those triggers are, and kind of what the main factors are that you're going to be watching for.
That makes sense. And then going back to some of the pitfalls. So, thinking of the typical path and the things that a startup would get into. So at some point, they might hire a vendor to do something. So what are some of the ways that can go wrong if it's not carefully handled?
Usually it goes wrong because they don't put documents in place, right? Right. And you just have this, and this the phone call I referred to earlier this morning. That's the issue, right? They have one document in place. It's a great document, I know, because we drafted it for them and they used it. But then they wanted to modify some terms and they created their own second document, but they never got it signed. And so without that being signed, now we have a lot of ambiguity in this case, and in a lot of cases, a lot of ambiguity around what's going to happen because they've started working together. It's a lot like what I said with founders. If you jump into a relationship and you don't decide what's going to happen if things don't go exactly as you're both expecting, what do you do? Well, that's okay and workable sometimes when you have two parties that are really, I'll call them good actors. They want to, they're well intentioned, they want to work together. You don't always have that though. Sometimes you have bad actors. I have a few experiences, unfortunately, with attorneys on other sides who I know I've been told they, from their close teammates usually after that attorney's kicked out or something, hey, they actually pride themselves in creating lopsided relationships.
Hmm.
Who wants to go into a lopsided relationship? Nobody. Nobody has that expectation. And so they do it covertly. They're like subversive and they hide the fact that it's lopsided and it doesn't come out until after the fact. If you
Huh.
married somebody like that,
Oh, total lack of trust.
I mean, yeah. And
Yeah.
so there are people who do this and they seem very trustworthy. They oftentimes have this, kind of high esteem in the community that you're in, mostly because people are afraid to say something different, right? And so they go in and it's a bad actor and you just get caught. So going in without documents create always creates problems. Sometimes those problems can be worked through, and sometimes you are caught in a spider's web, like intentionally. So if you're not documenting things properly and thoroughly, you're going to have issues just because expectations. you- I can guarantee you your expectations are not going to align in some way.
I mean, and there's so many, it's so easy now to just go online and, grab a free legal document for whatever you need and download it and say, great, now I have a contract with my clients, for example. But I would imagine that, that not knowing that that's obviously a very generic document that's not specific to your business. And it's only going to be when you run into, payment issues or the client suddenly ghosts you for a couple of months and now you have to worry about, when they come back again, what is your team has to incur a lot of extra restart costs, and that wasn't in the contract. And
Hmm.
it's I would assume that a little bit like, you could, if you, for medical situations, you could use your local walk-in clinic as your doctor, but if you actually have a doctor who carries through your medical journey with you, then when you have an appointment with them and you say something's going on, they're connecting the dots on some other things because they kind of understand you and the environment. So I would, in my mind, I would think that, having legal advice would be something similar to that.
That's a great analogy. I love it. I mean, you hear
Feel
about
free to
these.
use that.
What's that?
I said, feel free to use that.
I think I will. Thank you, Diane. You hear about these people who are in critical health situations, and they have a team of doctors, right? And that team of doctors will get together and they'll have their, I forget what they call the meeting, but they'll have their planning meeting where, every different discipline will sit down and say, hey, how do we do this? And what about this? And do we do this medication? And we are a lot like that. I mean, we're like we're traveling health, legal health team because we do have the expertise, and a quick question can save you a lot of time, and we also know where the interplay is in that kind of system level approach. We know when we tell you something about, you ask us about this, we know that, hey, we can give you the answer for that, but it's gonna carry over and play into these other things. So, so that's a great analogy. I love it.
I'm in a few CEO mastermind groups, and some are specific to marketing and some are more general strategy. And what I find interesting is that even when CEOs are in completely different industries, they share common challenges. Like a lot of issues boil down to HR and operations efficiency. Is it similar with legal needs, or are there more distinct needs by industry or by business stage in your experience?
I think it's overall similar, right? Every company is gonna have they're gonna have their team issues, they're gonna have their hiring employee issues, they're gonna have vendor issues, they're gonna have customer issues. I mean, if you don't have that, you have a unique business, right? But every company has all these things. Now, whether or not there's more emphasis on the product, on like I have some clients who are very much inventor innovative clients, and there's a lot more emphasis on patents and protecting their inventions, whereas others are much more service based, and so it's more of a brand type of emphasis and relationships and things like that. So there are differences, but it's more like the same buckets, just different proportions in
Different
those
angles.
buckets for the most part. There are some really specific areas of law, and this is why I'll talk to our clients. I'll say, hey, we cover 95 to 98% as a team of all the legal needs that you're going to have from the moment you have your idea to start a business till you start running a successful business. But there's a few things where we would even bring experts in. If you get into really specific tax law issues, or you need very specific HIPAA healthcare privacy compliance issues, some export controls things. We know the basics in those things, but sometimes the issues go beyond the basics, and we'll have to pull in, somebody in our network to help with those. Um, but the overall 95% of what companies are doing in most fields are gonna be the same buckets in different proportions.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, and I know you mentioned that you have a five-part model for evaluating strategy because amongst the other things that you do, in addition to being an attorney, you're also a strategist. And I'm assuming that determines what legal support is required. Could you talk to me more about that?
Yeah, I love discussing strategy. My interest stemmed from um, when I was drafting patent applications for large companies like IBM. And I was like, okay, I've drafted one more application. They're the biggest patentee, we call it, patent recipient in the United States for the last 40 years or whatever. Did I really, I was starting to question, did I contribute to anything here? And then I have other clients where they get one patent, that is their business, right? Like their business revolves around this one invention. So I started saying, well, how do patents really um, align, or maybe not align, with the business objectives? And that kind of led me down this whole path. That's when I went and got my MBA, and I use this as a tool to help me have more of a business discussion with my clients. And sometimes it's a little bit illuminating for them to think of it in this way too. So here's my definition of strategy. I think it's pretty broadly applicable, right? A strategy is a plan to deploy valuable resources for a sustainable advantage toward a business objective in a competitive environment. Those are the five pieces. I don't think though any of those are necessarily super surprising, but it helps really break down the conversation. Do you actually have a plan? If and we can talk about what a plan looks like or what SMART goals are, right? That might be the easiest one because everyone's got a plan. Do you have valuable resources? A lot of that revolves around what we call the IP in the business, whether it's patents or trademarks specifically, or your team or your methods, your procedures? What is your brand that you bring? Um, what are the valuable resources that you're creating or that you're licensing or that you're otherwise using and controlling in your business? And are you using them to create that sustainable advantage? Can I have an advantage? And that advantage is over your competitors, right? It's not like, oh, this is good generally. This is like an advantage over your competitors. Because if you're not talking about a competitive environment, you're not talking about a strategy. If I'm like, oh, my personal family strategy, I'm like, I wouldn't call that a strategy. You can use the term generally, but that's not a strategy. Strategy is when you are creating an advantage over competitors. And that gets to the fourth point, which is you're creating an advantage so that you can achieve a leadership position in the industry, right? A lot of times that comes down really broadly to, I think, price leadership or market leadership is what I would call it. Are you kind of the price leader? You have price efficiency in your model and you can kind of undercut everybody but still maintain margins? Or are you more of that market leadership? You have that brand, people will pay you, some premium. You're the Apple that will pay a premium even though you have a subpar product. Just kidding. I'm an Android guy. I'm sure Apple's product is great, but you know what I mean. Like, are you a market leader and you're really driving the brand and price and you're driving that value up, or are you a price leader and cutting costs and being efficient? If you're not working towards an objective in your industry, being second is kind of being last in a lot of ways. There's a lot of room and there's a lot of spectrum there, but I do think companies need to have that. And I think that's the number one thing they miss when they're talking about their own strategy. They don't really have an objective to become a leader in their industry. Now, the last factor is a competitive environment, and you can decide how you define that environment. Is this environment I'm a law firm. Am I competing against every other law firm for every other startup company out there? No, I'm not, right? I'm competing for startups, typically in e-commerce and SaaS, who typically don't have an attorney there. Maybe they've got their first attorney and need some help, but oftentimes they don't have an attorney. So we become their first legal team. We become their first attorney hire in essence. And the way we do it is really unique that offers broader perspective and experience and expertise than they can get by hiring one attorney. So all of that, I, I think you can take that same framework, those five parts, and you could apply that to any business and say, well, are you really meeting? Have you done something with each of those five parts? And do you really have a strategy, or do you just have a mission statement or a goal or maybe a cool product, So that's how
And
I
a
would
lot,
talk about
a
it.
lot of founders just get an idea in their head and kind of go for it and don't even have a plan. They just think the idea is cool and they just want to go build it. So that's something that, taking that step back and making sure that you've thought through each of those five parts of that model would, you're really, it's like a little mini business plan that you're doing for yourself.
It really is. And I run into a lot of different people. I run into academic researchers. I run into like true engineer inventors. I run into like, oh, excuse the term, but sales bros, right? We run into the guys. They know how to sell stuff like nobody else. But that'll get them so far, right? All of these people, they have their strengths, but you really need that to go from kind of that initial stage into a well-rounded sustainable business. You really need to, the sales guy probably needs the engineer, probably needs the researcher, probably needs the 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 attorney, the kind of compliant guy or the HR. And you need to start to build that and bring all that in.
Absolutely. One thing I'd like to ask you about is AI. So it's obviously impacting every single industry and, predicted to be exponentially this year. And I know a lot of people who are just, somebody will hand them a contract and they'll just upload it to ChatGPT and ask it a few questions, say, hey, what do I need to worry about here? How are you seeing AI disrupting the legal industry? And has that shifted at all the way that you're looking at working with clients or any additional pitfalls that you might need to keep them away from? What are you seeing that's changing and where's it going this year?
Oh, this year. I'll predict the next week. The
That
rest
is
of the
true.
year, it's
That is
so it's
true.
moving so fast.
A quarter at a time, maybe.
Listen, I love AI. I use it probably very ineffectively, but I love what I do with it in my business. Now, the thing about AI and law, there are several platforms. A couple platforms are being built to reduce or eliminate the what we call the hallucinations, right? The legal cases that get quoted that don't actually exist. You can get you can get fined, you can get held in contempt of court by filing briefs that have hallucinations in them. Um, Here's my general thought. Okay, we're not there where they're going to replace attorneys. You still need thoughtful, strategic people to help run your business. And part of that is because AI, the way that it runs right now, is is kind of gathering the mass average of everything that's out there. And that's assuming that it's even correct, which in a lot of cases it's not really even correct. So it's great if you want to source a lot of maybe diverse but average ideas, but it's not necessarily going, if AI was out there creating like um, better strategies than you can, then that would be really interesting. But it's like the way that it works on the back end really is to go out and look at everything and kind of pull the average, pull the most prominent things for whatever you asked and give it to you. Now, a lot of it you can do a lot of things with it if you know what to ask and you know how to filter what it gives to you, right? I've written papers and blog posts that I think are phenomenal. I have one on my blog about fractional legal teams. I used AI a lot to kind of source ideas for that, but what I got back was pretty average. Some of it wasn't correct. It certainly didn't explain how we operate as a team because nobody else calls anything out there a fractional legal team. So it was just making stuff up.
There we
Um,
go.
and the article was twice as long by the time I was done with it. And I appreciated all of the kind of the prompts and insights that came from my discussion, if you will, with ChatGPT at the time. But it doesn't think the way that we think. It doesn't innovate like, and that's my business. My business is working with innovators. And so in fact, here's an example. We have a company who called us and said, "Hey, we're starting to draft AI generated patents." And I said, my gut reaction is, well, crap. We do that. I have part of my team does that. I did that for 15 years. I know patents really well, and eventually maybe the technology will get to the point where it replaces patent attorneys to a large extent. I don't know. What I do know is we've had some interesting discussions, and one of these companies came back to us and said, "Hey, we're training our model. We'd like someone who really actually knows this stuff to come and help us, kind of quality control it." And so I see that there's probably a good business there for us to be the real experts behind maybe the face of the AI tool that is offering services to people. And we've done a few reviews of different AI generated patents. And our team has concluded, hey, they don't like, can you draft some things that look like a patent? Absolutely. Can you communicate them in maybe the same format? Yes. Can you do it in a way that clearly tells somebody what the invention is? Not really, right? And that's for several reasons. The invention might be in there, but you're not highlighting it. You're not explaining it in a way that people will relate to or that will capture broader protection, against competitors and stuff like that. So there's a long way to go. Um, at least in the legal field, there's a super long way to go. And a lot of it is people who go out there and use these tools, they don't know that what they're getting is at very best average and at worst has a lot of inaccuracies and maybe even hallucinations in them. So,
Mhm. I think that's good advice. And it does, I think we're seeing that across a number of industries where, and I do firmly believe that AI will replace many jobs, but it will also create other jobs for people who are able to, use AI to enable what they do. And your example of someone who maybe, a company who doesn't want to just put their information into a general model and train they want their own model. So obviously they're still, APIing into the LLMs, but they want their own model and they want to control their data, which is what we're seeing in a
mhm.
lot larger companies and even some mid-sized companies. But the idea of come work for me to come train that model, that's a job that didn't exist before. So that it's
Right.
kind of interesting the opportunities that we're seeing as a result. Are you also seeing differences in terms of when you're working with contracts? Are there aspects of how we use AI that now need to get worked into contracts?
Oh, for sure. Tons of attorneys are talking about the data privacy issues with AI. And every time a new thing comes out, what was the one that came? DeepSeek, right? Came out recently, and apparently it's super fast. I haven't used it. It's also based in China. And so but it can run locally too, I understand at a high level. And so if you run it locally, you can protect your data. But if you don't run it locally, you run it like on the web, then all of your data is being transmitted to China. And who's responsible for that? Because you get, so many businesses are built on the collection of other vendors and services. And so there's a ton of coordination that happens, especially in SaaS companies. Um, because you have a SaaS tool that's made available to a company that makes it available to its customers who use it then to do whatever they do. There's this chain of people who are all interested in what's happening. Well, there's also this chain of people who might be responsible at some level for a data breach, a leak of personal identifiable information. And how you allocate the risk and the liability and what type of insurance you need at your level within that contracted relationship, and whether or not you need more protection because contracts only take you so far. It doesn't mean somebody in this great country we have that somebody's not going to claim that you're responsible for more than you actually agreed to be responsible for, right? Um, so there's all sorts of issues like that are happening. There's a lot of, and then we have all the deep fakes or whatever might be out there, like the scams and phishing. Like it's a phenomenal tool, and like any great tool, it can be used in a good ways and bad ways. And sometimes the most lucrative ways to use these tools are the people who are doing it the wrong way, and that's going to play out in weird ways, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure, even just companies need to start considering how to write policies on how their employees should use
Hmm.
AI. So I'd imagine that would be something where you might want an attorney to take a look at those and just make sure that, from a labor law perspective, that, you're tightening what you need to tighten, but, you're also not violating any labor practices.
Yeah, we've written a few of those. It used to be it's very similar to what companies have what's become standard with like a social media policy. Now it's AI policies.
Yeah.
Another really interesting place where AI is coming in, and this is getting clarified by the courts and by the government entities in charge of things. But can AI be an inventor? The answer in the U.S. is no. The answer in some other countries is yes. Can you use AI to help with an invention? The answer is yes, maybe in some situations if you meet the criteria. Otherwise it becomes an AI invention and then it's not patentable. And if it's not patentable, then you can't stop somebody. You could develop this AI invention, but this AI developed invention, but you couldn't stop somebody else from doing it. So you don't really own it. Same thing with copyrights, right? In the
Gonna say
US.
copyright, that's going to blow up because the LLMs were all trained on copyrighted material. So
Right.
there's people out there who are theorizing that, there's a lot of these lawsuits that are just being kept in the courts to extend until the point where the law changes regarding use of copyrighted material to train models.
Oh yeah, good old submarine rules, submarining tactics, huh? Yeah, but yeah, and so it opens up the opportunity for, people like us to say, well, I'm just gonna use ChatGPT to create my website. Well, that website now, while it's yours, anybody could copy it if ChatGPT or another, AI platform created it, because in the US you don't own that copyright because it wasn't created by an author, by a person. And so we don't recognize ownership of AI created works of art, and so somebody else could copy it. So now, is it worth it to use it for the efficiencies, knowing that you don't own it? That to me, I think you want to own the brand, the image, the materials that you have. I think there's value in that. So yeah, it's going to play out really weird all the way across every business. But I don't know how to predict where it's going to be.
You and I are going to have a conversation probably a month from now, and everything will have changed anyway. So, and as of the the date that we're publishing this, just we'll keep that in mind, audience, because you never know. There might have been some announcements that shake this whole thing up. But
Could be.
well, Jeff, this has been a fascinating conversation. What is the best way for people to reach out to you?
I love connecting with people on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. So if you go to LinkedIn, look up Jeff Holman. My company is Intellectual Strategies, and you'll see some tagline about we build or we help companies with fractional legal teams. So it's pretty identifiable there. So LinkedIn's a great place to connect. Just shoot me an invitation, send me a message, whatever. The other thing we do is for clients who are coming in, they want to know if we're a good fit for them. We do a free 30-minute strategy call. So we'll sit down, we'll talk about your milestones, talk about the chaos that you're creating and the things that might need a little bit of cleanup. And so happy to chat with people about that. The easiest way to sign up for that is just on our website, which is intellectualstrategies.com. You can see my calendar, you can book a call with us, and then we can chat and see what's going on.
That's great. It's been really helpful. Thanks so much for joining me today, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's been great.